Good morning, NSF. Thank you very much for being here this morning. We are very pleased to have an excellent speaker and panel from USIP and a discussant from our own NSF community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, and to give us an introduction, introduce your colleagues who are here as well, and then jump into your presentation.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you very much. I am just going to hopefully successfully share my screen here. Well, thank you, Maureen, and thank you to the National Security Forum of Northern Nevada for inviting and hosting me this morning. Particularly, I was telling Maureen and Kerry, I was just speaking before we came on, I've been looking at the news from your part of the country, and it seems like you've been having a rough few weeks between wildfires and an earthquake last week. So I hope you're staying both well and safe, and really thank you for taking the time to join this morning. I and we are so pleased to have this opportunity to build on the relationship that USIP has been developing with NSF over the past year or so. I know most recently, I think you heard from a couple of my colleagues engaged with them as part of your Youth Security Forum. And I believe back in December, you had the opportunity to hear from my colleague, Andrew Wilder, on Afghanistan. So it's really my honor and pleasure to follow those distinguished colleagues of mine. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. I know you've had, as just mentioned, some speakers from the U.S. Institute of Peace before, but I thought it worth giving you some introduction to who we are as an institute and how we work on the conflict that we'll be discussing today. So I'll give you a few words on that. And I've taken the liberty here of providing a roadmap for the conversation going forward. I also took the liberty of putting the word roadmap in quotes. I couldn't resist. For some of you who may be familiar with this issue, the roadmap actually refers in this context to a US-backed peace proposal that was first formally put forward by President George W. Bush in, I think, 2003, it was formally proposed. And the idea was that it would set a series of benchmarks that the Israelis and Palestinians would follow over the course of 3 years to reach an agreement and eventually a Palestinian state. That did not bear fruit. So I am hoping that I meet more of my benchmarks today as we move through this presentation. I'm mindful that Maureen has asked me to speak for 30 minutes. So on the one hand, as I was just saying, I'm a little bit mortified that you all have to listen to me speak for 30 minutes, but at the same time, I also recognize that we have an ambitious agenda of topics to cover, and 30 minutes doesn't allow a lot of time to go into depth on all these issues. So I do look forward to going in more depth on the issues you want to talk about in the Q&A. And I'm thrilled in that regard as well to be joined by some of my colleagues at USIP, who I'm honored to work with and learn from every single day. Going across the screen, we have my boss and the Vice President of our Middle East Center at USIP, Dr. Mike Yaffe. Mike has served in a variety of US government positions over many years, and most recently was at the State Department as Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, back when Secretary Kerry under the Obama administration was leading the last round of final status negotiations. Our distinguished senior fellow, Ambassador Hisham Youssef, is with us. Ambassador Youssef was a former career Egyptian diplomat, held several senior positions and senior positions in the Arab League and in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and is a longtime veteran of diplomacy on this issue of Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian peace. And last but not least, my colleague Robert Barron, a program officer in our team, also heavily engaged in Track 2 efforts on this issue, and also author of a couple of pieces you may have seen when Maureen sent around some of the links, I think, to resources we've written. Most recently, he wrote something co-authored with a colleague of mine on Palestinian politics. So as I mentioned to a couple of you earlier, when we get to Q&A, I think it's going to feel a bit to me like those game shows where you call a friend or dial a lifeline, because I will certainly be calling on the expertise of my colleagues as well to talk us through and give perspectives on this issue. I should add on that note, as I move into describing USIP and its work, the views I expressed today and perspectives I offer are my own. The U.S. Institute of Peace does not take affirmative policy positions. We have experts who provide analysis and perspective that hopefully informs decision-making. But I look forward to, again, sharing my perspective and analysis, and my colleagues likewise sharing theirs as we move into discussion. The U.S. Institute of Peace, so as some of you already know, we were founded, signed into being in 1984 under legislation signed by President Ronald Reagan. We are a country's national, nonpartisan, independent of the executive branch institute, founded by Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for US and global security. Again, we are nonpartisan. We have a Senate-confirmed, fully bipartisan board. And we have one agenda, if you will, which is peacemaking, to find ways to prevent, mitigate, resolve violent conflict non-violently where it happens around the world. As mentioned, we were created in 1984, and our creation was actually a result of a couple of movements that converged. Inside Congress, this push started in the 1960s, led by veterans from both sides of the aisle who were veterans of World War II and were really impacted by what they saw and experienced in the war, and drew parallels with the nation's 4 military academies and felt, boy, if we're investing all this money, time, energy, and resources in how to be the best at war, we really should be giving equal attention to seriously studying the practice of peace. And so that was really the genesis. And in the 1970s, this movement got more momentum from a 1,000-strong grassroots movement across the United States. And that's really what brought us into being as the institute that we are today. We serve as, again, a nonpartisan government partner and trusted intermediary between governments, the US government and other international governments, and also civil society actors, stakeholders in the conflicts in which we work. We work what we like to say top down and bottom up, connecting diplomatic and political efforts with the work of grassroots constituencies to really forge that connectivity and bring about a positive, peaceful environment in the places in which we're focused. We try to link our research with our action. We train and educate. We provide policy recommendations to decision makers. We partner with civil society organizations in the places in which we work. We convene diverse audiences across a variety of perspectives and views. Again, our agenda is peacemaking and peace building. And that means we talk to a variety of stakeholders trying to find ways to bridge divides across conflicting communities. Now, while USIP's mission is devoted to overseas work that is international, we also, per our mandate, are called upon to serve the American people directly and provide education and information on our mission and the connection of our mission to US security interests. We have a dedicated public education team who carries out this work, and I'm thrilled as well to be joined by my colleague Anne-Louise Colgan today, who directs our public education, does yeoman's work really reaching out across all 50 states, including, of course, Nevada, to organizations like your own, to schools, to universities, providing educational resources, access to our expertise, and many other ways to engage. If I may, a brief promotion at this point for those of you who are lifelong learners. We have a host on our website of online courses. The entire catalog is online, and I believe they are all tuition free at this point, at least until the end of the year. So again, those resources can be found on our website, and we always welcome the opportunity to engage. Shifting now to our work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It may not be surprising and is a commentary, I think, on the nature of this conflict and its persistence that this is probably our longest sustained engagement at the Institute on the conflict. We really began working robustly on this very early on in our history, late 80s, certainly early 90s. And we address the conflict in this holistic way that we address all our work at USIP. Again, top down and bottom up, we inform the policymaking process, providing tools and ideas to decision makers through working group efforts, briefings. We work to empower grassroots actors to address conflict drivers within and between their societies, either through grants or direct co-creation of programs or training in some cases. Our goal is to really help professionalize the peace building field, to maximize the investment of US and other actors who put resources into that kind of work. And the other piece of this is what I call the intermediate or connective tissue layer, this top down, bottom up, and then middle out, if you will. We work to build the institutional capacity of the Israelis and Palestinians, particularly in this case, to strengthen their state building potential outcomes and foster some mutually beneficial cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians that can lead to de-escalating tension on the ground and hopefully moving the needle towards conflict resolution. I will note just on that we do that work in partnership with the Office of the Quartet, which is based in Jerusalem. My colleague Neil Kurtz, I don't think could join us today, but he works with us and also as a senior advisor with them, bringing USIP best practices to their work, seeking to strengthen Palestinian justice and security institutions, enhance the rule of law, and focus on good governance and economic growth. I will skim through these slides now, just as brief examples of what this work looks like that I have described. Here you see the pictures of a couple of publications. In the vein of our policy informing work, we have an Arab-Israeli study group that produced these 2 volumes, and a sequel is in process. The idea here is that we took a long look in the mirror as the US, and our role as the US as an actor trying to bring about peace and mediate the Middle East peace over so many years. What lessons have we derived from those experiences? The last book, The Peace Puzzle, which came out in 2013, looked at our role between the years 1989 to 2011, and the sequel that's in process is bringing that record up to date, going through the end of this past Trump administration and their efforts to broker peace in this conflict. I mentioned our work with the Office of the Quartet, just a concrete example of what some of that work looks like and some of the impacts it can yield. One of the things my colleague has done with his colleagues at the Office of the Quartet is work to map the realities on the ground of Israeli and Palestinian security coordination, the reality of Palestinian police movement and access across the West Bank in this case, and using that mapping that they did, work to facilitate coordination and trust building between Israelis and Palestinians to help expand that Palestinian footprint, to help expand Palestinians' ability to have access to their own policing. And as a result of that, just in terms of tangible outputs, the number of West Bank Palestinians with no access to police services dropped by 97%. And 1.8 million people now have access to policing who didn't have that benefit of law enforcement for the first time in a couple of decades. This obviously can have knock-on implications for creating an environment that is stronger for economic investment. And so all of these things are really with an eye to improving conditions on the ground, but hopefully propelling momentum towards building trust and fostering conditions that can propel and sustain an eventual diplomatic process. Finally, our work with grassroots actors, and this will enable us to segue into some of the dynamics we've seen on the ground recently in this conflict. We work through grants, again, and direct engagement to support and train civil society organizations. Through grants, we've actually invested in a couple of projects that have trained hundreds of Israeli police to facilitate police community engagement, diffusing tensions and common conflict flashpoints within Israel in this case, and also relatedly worked with Israeli Jewish and Palestinian Muslim religious leaders who are building to support their building of networks that work to use that influence with their communities to calm crises around shared religious sites and mixed Jewish Arab cities in Israel. So these are just some of examples of some of the work that we have done. On this note of calming tensions, this is a sad but apt segue into a snapshot of what we've seen in recent months. It has certainly been an active and combustible few months on this conflict. I call it a snapshot. I realize this is framed as a timeline. And the reason I am taking the time to say this is I'm always very wary of timelines with any conflict, and particularly this one, because timelines, depending on where one chooses to start one's timeline, can inadvertently suggest a position on where a conflict started and who was most proximately to blame. And the reality here, of course, is all these most proximate events that we are seeing came about building on years and years of brewing dynamics. And so the attempt here of this visual is just to start this particular snapshot in April, when tensions really began rising prominently and hitting the headlines in Jerusalem during the month of Ramadan, which also happened to coincide with a number of days of significance to Jewish populations inside Israel, and made for a rather combustible brew. You've had Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian, mostly youth violent classes in Jerusalem throughout the month of April. You also had clashes then in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, a predominantly Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem, where there are pending home evictions. Lower courts in Israel had ruled that Palestinian families would be evicted in accordance with Israeli laws. We can go into that in more detail, either in the Q&A or a little bit later in the presentation. The higher court, Supreme Court final decision was actually postponed with acknowledgement of the fact that this was a combustible environment, and that higher court decision was due to come about at the beginning of August. But tensions really ratcheted up in that neighborhood during this time. Amid all this, the Israeli police ended up entering the Al-Aqsa compound, the Holy Esplanade that the Jewish Israelis refer to as the Temple Mount. For Muslims, it's the Al-Aqsa compound. Again, this was during Ramadan. In response to stone throwing from up on the compound, Israeli police entered the compound, causing further tensions. This was a straw that broke the camel's back. For many parties, Hamas, who had been threatening to take action if things did not quiet down in Jerusalem, then fired rockets into Israel. And this marked 11 days of war we saw in May. A ceasefire was eventually achieved at the end of this war, though it is fragile and still parties are working to shore this up. And of course, bookmarking or bookending, I should say, this whole timeline, you have two sets of political dynamics going on in Israeli and Palestinian arenas. At the beginning of April, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, based in the West Bank, announced that he was postponing much awaited elections by the Palestinians. They were to be the first legislative elections, which were then to lead to presidential elections, the first ones in 15 years. He announced that he was postponing those elections ostensibly because of Israel's refusal to let voting take place in East Jerusalem. Though, as we can discuss a little later when we get to these dynamics, there was a strong feeling by many, including among many Palestinians, that this also served as a pretext for Abbas, who was maybe concerned that the outcome would not be as he wished it to be. You also, at the other end of the bookend, had a new coalition government form in Israel. It formed on June 3rd and was sworn into office on June 13th. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but this comes after 2 years of complete political paralysis in Israel. You've had 4 elections where no coalition was able to be formed. And so really at the 11th hour, Israel ended up on June 3rd with a new coalition that really brings together quite a diverse set of bedfellows. Again, a an issue we can get into in more detail as people are interested. I'm just using the chance here. If people are interested in reading more about that sort of succession of events or sequence of events that happened in April, May, my colleague Robert, who is online with us, wrote a fantastic piece at the beginning of this time period, laying out some of these dynamics, sort of putting them in perspective and in context. So I do highly recommend taking a look at that also on our website. On the Israeli political arena, again, there's been this 2 years of political paralysis. I think the most important thing to realize about this new Israeli government is that they refer to themselves as the Change Coalition. And really what that signals is the key factor that brought this really disparate group of parties together, which was a desire to change the government that had been in place in Israel, led by former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for 12 years. It brings together parties that include the conservative Islamic Ra'am party. This marks actually the first time that an independent Arab party had joined an Israeli government coalition. It brings together a Jewish nationalist party and 6 other parties across the right and left wing spectrum of Israeli politics. So really, as you see, this Change Coalition name is the most meaningful. The one thing that brought them together was a united effort to move on beyond the Netanyahu era. In terms of whether it will signal change on other issues, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course that remains to be seen, but the challenges are manifold in this regard because, as I've mentioned, the different perspectives these parties bring. I think as much as possible, what we're going to expect to see with this government is an effort to avoid as much as possible. We'll talk about how that might not be easy, but to avoid as much as possible, diving right in on issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and instead trying to focus on consensus issues where they can. But what it also means is that there will be a check on each of the different parties' maximalist aspirations because the way the structure of the government is set up is that different players will have a veto on other players' abilities to do something. So those further to the right will not be able to push their ideal agenda, and those further to the left likewise won't be able to do the same. And so it's going to be an interesting experiment in what this coalition can get done. And again, happy to discuss further as we move along in the discussion. On the Palestinian side of the ledger, Palestinian politics are also very much in disarray. You've had a situation of divided rule for many years, basically since 2006, the last time that there were elections held. You have Hamas ruling Gaza and Fatah controlling the West Bank as the head of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, which is the administrative body there. In the West Bank. I mentioned the postponed elections. In recent weeks, you've also seen a significant amount of dissatisfaction and brewing unrest among Palestinians in the West Bank with their own leadership. The May outbreak of violence really seemed to undermine public belief that the Palestinian Authority was credibly serving its role resisting the Israeli occupation. And for many Palestinians, the role that Hamas ended up taking, seizing the resistance mantle, using the opportunity of what was happening in Jerusalem to engage in a war with Israel, actually, as we'll see as we look at some of the numbers later, ended up boosting Hamas's popularity and really decreasing the amount of support, which was already pretty minimal, that Palestinians had for the West Bank leadership, who they'd increasingly seen as ineffective, corrupt, and increasingly authoritarian. And in the last couple of weeks, you've seen protests in the streets after the prominent death of a prominent critic of the Palestinian Authority, who died while in detention, having been arrested by Palestinian security forces. So again, you're seeing a groundswell of dissatisfaction and protest in the Palestinian streets against what they see as the corruption and authoritarianism of their own leadership. Jerusalem, I have mentioned, you've got ongoing tensions that always, for anybody that was surprised when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict burst back onto the headlines again, nobody really should have been. And particularly the fact that it burst into the headlines centered on events in Jerusalem should truly not have been surprising. Time and again, this is the pattern that Jerusalem ends up being the flashpoint from which all sparks emanate. You had, as I mentioned, the tensions around the holy sites on the Holy Esplanade. You had the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and other neighborhoods in East Jerusalem where the threat of evictions of Palestinian families are happening on a daily basis. And again, we have a key court case coming up on August 2nd, what will rule specifically on what's happening in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, and which could really serve to bring things to a head. And again, I put here, and you see in the headline, the idea of representation. What was interesting to watch in this last round of fighting, again, Hamas is a pretty opportunistic player here, did manage it for the first time, typically in past rounds of fighting that we have seen between Hamas and Israel. Hamas's stated goals have more typically been addressing conditions in Gaza and the siege in Gaza. This one was very squarely framed in terms of defending Palestinian rights in Jerusalem. And so what we've seen here is a real effort, and not just focusing as well. Hamas and its rhetoric around this did not just focus on what was going on as the holy sites, as you might expect, but also focus very much on what is happening in these areas of East Jerusalem where Palestinians are under threat of eviction. The war that followed, again, a fragile ceasefire was reached, but the key word is fragile. The priority right now of the international community is trying to shore up that ceasefire and focus on the reconstruction efforts that are needed given the damage and destruction that Gaza suffered once again. We've all seen this movie before, unfortunately, and we keep finding ourselves back here. We have rounds of fighting, we have efforts at reconstruction, and little momentum after the dust has settled, if you will, to try to move beyond the dynamics and address the underlying conflict drivers that could stop these events from happening again. So all eyes are on reconstruction right now. It poses a few sets of conundrums for those working on this issue. Specifically, how do you get reconstruction aid into Gaza without it lining the pockets of Hamas, which is very much strongly in the interest of the international community and donor community not to do. So there are efforts afoot right now to try to, by the US and others, to try to re-empower, re-embolden the Palestinian Authority, find a mechanism whereby perhaps support can go through them. And currently it's the idea is that the UN will serve as the mechanism through which the support can go. But these are all the immediate proximate issues that the international community is dealing with, rather than focusing at this point on the underlying drivers that will need to be addressed to ensure that we don't find ourselves back in the same situation. I want to point out a dynamic that was actually quite new when we talk about this movie that we've seen before and what played out in Jerusalem and between Israel and Gaza recently. And that was what some Israeli politicians even refer to as a civil war that emerged in Israel. What we saw happen in this last round of fighting in May is violence exploding in what are called the mixed cities in Israel between Jewish and Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. And really in a way that had not been seen for many years. Again, I mentioned earlier that this is an area, what are often called shared society. The relations between Jewish and Arab citizens in Israel is something we have worked on at USIP, but the violence that exploded, I think, really shook many people to the core and underscored the need for more of that kind of work and more attention to be paid by these underlying drivers that have tended to go unaddressed. I will note that the picture I have here on this slide, which actually in both Hebrew and Arabic is the Gandhi quote, "Be the change that you want to see in the world," is a mural on the wall of a school called the Hand in Hand School in Israel, which is a mixed schools. The one school system in Israel that is bilingual education that educates both Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel simultaneously from kindergarten through high school. So again, there are these pockets of shared society, but the tensions that erupted are certainly something of new concern and of note to Israeli-Palestinian politicians. These recent dynamics come in the context of longer-term trends, and I'm going to sort of pull all these longer-term trends up right now as I identify them. Consensus paradigms are eroding. What I mean by consensus paradigms is for years, the international community, as it's so called, and the parties themselves were really operating in a framework in which the two-state solution was the end goal, an Israeli and Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security. What we've seen in the last few years is an erosion in the discourse around that as a direction. We saw with the previous US administration, the Trump administration was the first to move us off that direction after many decades of US, or rather a couple of decades of US consensus around the two-state solution, North Star, if you will. Some of you might recall his first meeting with Netanyahu, where President Trump said, I've looked at two states, so I've looked at one state, I'll take the one that the parties like best. And that was really seen as a dramatic shift of raising the question of whether two states was really the direction we're heading. Beyond that, though, beyond the international community, it's the attitudes of Israelis and Palestinians themselves on the ground are shifting away from support for this option. And we can talk about that in a little bit more depth and nuance in a moment. But this comes in the context of hardening attitudes on both sides. And these hardline attitudes are actually more prominent, frighteningly enough, in the younger generations. The younger the population you're polling, the harder line that attitudes are towards the other side. So again, we at USIP have our work cut out for us when we work on this issue. It's an environment, it's really a mirror image environment, I call it, of mutual distrust and disillusionment. Both sides will say we have no partner for peace. There is no good faith partner on the other side. We want peace, the other side doesn't. It's a mirror set of mantras. And you can see how this came about after years of tried and failed diplomatic attempts. You had the Second Intifada, which decimated what was known as the Israeli peace camp. The Second Intifada for many Israelis was the time where everybody knew somebody who had been impacted by a cafe bombing, a bus bombing. And for Israelis, this really shook many of their belief in the idea that they could make peace with the other side. Likewise, the Palestinians suffered greatly with the security measures and the response to the Second Intifada. It was a time that set back Palestinian pursuit of peace and belief in a good faith partner, as have been the subsequent attempts at diplomacy, subsequent attempts at negotiations, and seeing no movement towards progress towards a state. So right now, when you poll Israelis and Palestinians, what you'll see is most will say, I don't believe that a two-state solution is possible in my lifetime. We also have to zoom out and look at a changing regional environment. Most of you will be aware of the Abraham Accords and additional Israeli-Arab normalization agreements that were signed beginning last August. We can talk about some of the implications of that and the impact this has on the conflict. And we're also at a time where the international actors, the US very much among them, are discouraged and distracted. This conflict has absorbed much attention and resources over much time, with, to some people's mind, very little yield, at the same time as there are a plethora of other domestic and foreign policy issues that are rising to the top of governments' agendas. And so this is also another factor we have to look at when we see what might be diplomatically possible going forward. I just want to give you again a snapshot of what I was talking about, these sort of hardline attitudes and lack of faith aside. This to me is a striking chart. This comes from a poll that was done jointly by Khalil Shakaki and Dalia Shendlin, both prominent Palestinian and Israeli pollsters, with whom we have worked as well on projects at USIP. And this was when they jointly polled. They've been jointly polling for years, Israelis and Palestinians. And I don't know how well you can see this slide, but this is just a slide showing support for two-state solution between 2006 and 2018, this slide. And if you see the blue line is Israelis, the red line is Palestinians, you can see the precipitous decline over years. Back in 2006, you had Israeli support at 68% and Palestinian support at 71%. And when down in 2018, it's lower than that again today to 49% and 43%. So you see the challenge that the international community, the Israelis and Palestinians themselves. I'll keep some of these slides on poll findings in the Palestinian public side and Israeli public side for a little later in discussion. What I would like to talk about a little bit is this changing regional context. I've put up a piece here again, if you want to know more about it. This is one of many pieces that my colleague Ambassador Hisham Youssef has written recently on the new normalization agreements and their potential for facilitating Israeli-Palestinian peace. What I've done is try to briefly here take a look at these new agreements and take a look at what they are, the context in which they happened, what they do spell, what they don't spell, and what the context was around them. They certainly, to my mind, were a big diplomatic achievement with game-changing potential. What they were not, I would say, are peace agreements that ended state of war. We have to keep in mind that these countries, the countries that entered into agreements, particularly the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, had not been at war with Israel. And in fact, there had been a lot of quiet cooperation. In the case of Morocco, there had been some less quiet cooperation earlier on during multilateral regional efforts in the 90s that had fallen asunder around the time of the Second Intifada. But there had been quiet cooperation happening under the table by some of these countries in the years preceding the Abraham Accords. And really what this came about as was a response to a shared threat and interest assessment by Israel and certainly the Gulf states with whom they've entered into agreements and some that they might yet enter into agreements with, who are focused on Iran as a shared regional threat and the idea that there is much to be gained both from a strategic security perspective as well as economic perspective to fostering relations with each other. What they are not, I would say, and this was the question many had, is a direct line to Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution. For many years, a lot of people talked about the outside-in approach of the Trump administration, focusing on agreements with Arab states and Israel, and talked about that as though it was a new approach. It really wasn't. Again, an effort to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict regionally, you saw most robustly in the 1990s with the Madrid process. And then in 2002, we saw the Arab Peace Initiative, where an initiative by Saudi Arabia that laid out a framework by which the Arab states said that we will normalize relations with Israel if Israel agrees to a two-state solution with the Palestinians with a certain number of conditions, with the capital for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, borders along the 67 lines. There was a framework in the Arab Peace Initiative for how these Arab actors would like to see this conflict resolved. And the Arab Peace Initiative was a promise that at the end of that process, there would be full normalization. So again, what these normalization accords were really put an end to that paradigm, that conditioning paradigm. It front-loaded the normalization. But what it did not do, and I think this is an important thing for us to keep in mind, it did not end the API end goal vision of two states. These Arab states who have entered into agreements with Israel still articulate quite vociferously that the end goal for them is a two-state solution, that is how they'd like to see the conflict resolved. So it is still very much an alive and well notion. I can just skip through this slide, we can get to it. It's just talking about the transactional nature of some of these agreements that were signed between Israel and the Arab states and what the different states got from these agreements. Pathways forward in these tense dynamics. What we've learned in the past few weeks, if we didn't already know it, or I should say what the administration and international community should have learned, is that this is a conflict that won't be ignored. I think the Biden administration entered office wanting to deprioritize this issue. They did not want this front and center on their foreign policy agenda. But this conflict has a way of forcing itself onto the agenda, and it probably did it sooner maybe than they had hoped. Again, this was not an inexperienced administration. Many of them have worked on this issue before, most recently during the round of negotiations in 2014. So while it might not have taken them by surprise, they were still in a situation where they now do have to focus on how they're going to approach this policy-wise. They have been hard at work, I would say, resetting the North Star. They've spent a lot of time focusing on how the two-state solution is indeed the US goal and priority for ending this conflict. What will need to happen for anything to move forward in the coming months, I think, is to see how that rhetoric and articulation of a vision is shored up with action. And there are a lot of tests coming up with the dynamics that are brewing on the ground. They are looking, I think you're seeing the Biden administration looking to create effective and right-sized channels of engaging this conflict. They were sort of caught flat-footed when this first exploded in April and May. They had no ambassador out there in Israel. The consulate in Jerusalem that had effectively been the representation of the Palestinians had been closed under the Trump administration. The Biden administration is now looking to reopen that consulate in Jerusalem and reset the relationship with the Palestinians to be able to play more of the traditional mediating role between the two parties. But I think what I would call it, I will just end here for now, what I would call the need for the US administration and other international actors to do is look for ways to, if they're not going to dive right into negotiations, which my assessment is they are not going to, and we can talk about that more, they can't just be caught in the business of firefighting when things flare. They have to be looking to what I would call fireproofing, addressing these conflict drivers that when they fester and are left unaddressed as they have for many years, end up exploding time and again and setting us back years at a time. So I will end there and open. I know that Kerry, I think, had some comments that he wanted to make, and then I can open to questions and go into more detail in any of these pieces that I laid out.
Thank you, Lucy. That was a tour de force across a lot of history and recent history, and I really appreciate you walking us through that. I think it's incredibly important for us to get that perspective from just even what's happened in the last 6 months. So thank you. That was terrific. We did ask Harry, who is an NSFer, and has some interesting history, to give us his perspective from having been in Israeli for many years, and for some of the early peace efforts and where he thinks we're going now. And Kerry, you got 5 minutes.
All right, well, quickly. Lucy, that was a great job. Difficult topic. You covered it wonderfully. Appreciate that. All right. Two-state solution. And let me say, personally, I absolutely believe in the two-state solution. But what I can give you now is the Israeli man or woman in the street perspective. When I was in Israel and serving in the military, we believed that there was going to be peace. In fact, the most popular song that we sang going into battle in 1973 when I was in the infantry was, "I promise you, my little baby daughter, that this will be the last war." And that resonated with me because when that war broke out, I had a 3-month-old daughter who spent a lot of time in a bomb shelter. But I believed that there was going to be peace. And one of the reasons I believed there was going to be peace, at least with the Egyptian side, is that I interacted with Egyptian citizens in the town of Kantara. There was no hatred there, and there certainly was no hatred on the Israeli side. Interacting with Egyptian soldiers while there was a ceasefire across the Suez Canal, they were friendly to us, we were friendly to them. There was no anonymity, there was no enmity, there was no enmity there, right? And even in 73, when the fighting stopped and the big muckety mucks were sitting down at kilometer 101 negotiating, we simple soldiers were out in the field and somebody would say, "Hey, we caught a goose. You guys got some vegetables? Well, let's have a hafla. Let's have a barbecue together." And we did. We would meet between the lines. That feeling disappeared. Peace has to come not only from the leaders and not only from the pieces of paper, but from the feeling of the people and the populace involved. I think one of the reasons that Hamas took over Gaza when it did was that we all expected, the PLO would take over Gaza. Well, they got kicked out because the people in Gaza weren't ready for these steps that they perceived that the PLO was making toward Israel. So I can speak from the Israeli point of view, but I think you are absolutely right, Lucy. They are mirror images of each other, right? And what I'm saying from the Israeli point of view follows also for the Palestinian point of view, only I can give you my side of it. As far as Israel is concerned, the essential question is not Jerusalem or not any piece of land. It's the existence of the state of Israel and the recognition of the state of Israel. As a nation, it's a much, much broader picture, not just as a member of the UN and whatnot, but our very existence. And that existence is always in doubt. Israel has never been a nation like any other nation. If you pardon the expression, we have been the town Jew in the village of the world, right? You look at the vast number of UN resolutions against Israel. You look at the lack of acceptance of Israel, certainly in the academic community. And as an Israeli, yeah, I look at these peace treaties and say, those are pieces of paper. And their real value, maybe it'll come in the nenext time. Well, in Hebrew, you'd say, for Kabbalat Shabbat. It would be useful for the next time there's a toilet paper shortage. Those are only pieces of paper. You need the connection between the people. You need this feeling. And if we are going to truly pursue peace, Israel on its side needs to feel not as a pariah nation in the world, where even groups like in the United States, Black Lives Matter, they've got a lot to say against Israel. They don't look at all the thousands of Blacks in Africa being slaughtered all the time, but what's going on in Israel, that concerns them. So Israel feels like a pariah nation and its future is in doubt. And my Palestinian friends feel exactly the same thing. They even look at Jordan, which they say to me, there are more Palestinians in Jordan than the Husseini family. They were implanted on us. That's a colonial remnant. We need a solution that both sides feel secure in. All the rest of this is going to keep bubbling over at flashpoints. That's my 5 minutes, Maureen, but I could certainly go on.
Well, thank you, Kerry. I really appreciate that. And I do welcome any questions from our participants as well. I fast forward a little bit. So my experience in Israel, of course, was during the first Intifada when I was there from 87 until 91. Doing my postdoctoral work at the Hebrew University, and a very, likewise perspective. The discussions on the ground and the peace movement on the ground at the time was really had an element of hope. And unfortunately, I've seen that dissipate among my friends and colleagues who are still in Israel. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to touch on something, Lucy, that you didn't mention, but I think some of your other panelists may want to join in. And that's simply, we're in the middle of a pandemic. How did COVID impact where we are, or did it? And is there any hope that getting out of the pandemic will bring us to a different position, or is it not an overwhelming factor?
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you, Kerry, for sharing your analysis and very personal perspective and experience on this conflict. Let me, Maureen, I'm just starting with your question on COVID. It's an interesting question and I think it touches on all these dynamics we talked about, because I think, actually, not to shamelessly tout again a piece on our website, but I think early on when COVID was making its way around the world, I think Robert and I wrote something that talked about some of the potential opportunities, which apply globally as well, that things like matters of shared mutual interest and concern, like a pandemic, like environmental problems that know no boundaries. We looked at how this could create some opportunity, actually, for Israeli-Palestinian cooperation. Again, Israelis and Palestinians are living, as one colleague of mine describes it, cheek by jowl. There is intense interaction. And so it is not possible to form a border or a boundary to keep out a pandemic as it's spreading. And I think early on, and my colleagues can jump in here as well, early on in this period of time, there was actually strong cooperation between the Israeli and Palestinian authorities, certainly in the West Bank, around trying to stop the spread and help each other keep things from getting out of hand. Political dynamics and other things happening ultimately got in the way. The mutual distrust set in, and it did not prove to be a lasting factor or momentum towards creating, opportunity to move things forward in a more positive direction. There became arguments when the vaccine came out about what Israel's responsibility was for vaccinating the Palestinians. There was then a development just a few weeks ago where the Israeli government did provide some vaccinations to the Palestinians, and that itself became controversial because the Palestinians rejected some of them, saying they were too close to expiration date. And what you see with all these situations is all the mutual mistrust Ray was talking about finds its way into all these situations that could otherwise be opportunities for cooperation. I think, just in terms of the pandemic, Israel is doing far better than certainly the Palestinians have been doing. They were able to get out early ahead of most people, most other countries in the world actually on vaccination. They are seeing some spikes right now. The Palestinians are still lagging behind in vaccinations. So it still is a concern, but I don't know if Robert or Hisham, you had anything to add, or if you're still with us on that particular point.
Thank you. Yes, sometimes those crises bring people together. Sometimes it just compounds the situation. I'm going to actually bounce a question. Sure, Carrie, go ahead.
I think you hit it right on the head, Lucy. There was one place that was an exception where there was immense cooperation between the Israeli and the Palestinian medical groups, and those were the emergency response groups. The Red Crescent, Magen David Adom, the Israeli Red Cross kind of thing. When that fighting was going on, they worked together seamlessly. Yeah. And that gave me a little bit of hope in a world that I don't have a lot of hope in, but yeah.
I mean, certainly, and we've seen this before, the healthcare sector, now I'm talking now actually within Israel, as opposed to cross-border Israel and the Palestinian territories, but the health sector traditionally within Israel has been the place where you've seen the strongest roots of coexistence and cooperation. It's quite frequently the example that's held up as a sector where you find that kind of promise and hope.
Indeed. So let me turn to your other colleagues here, Lucy, and I'll let you have the last word on this, but I would like to get their perspectives as well. And Anne-Louise knows well, NSF is really engaged in reaching out to the next generation. We sponsor the Youth Security Forum. We work very hard to get our young members of the community engaged and informed so they can be informed citizens, but they can also hopefully take that knowledge forward with them as they pursue whatever careers they want. So I'm going to ask your panelists, starting with Ambassador Yosef, what do you say to the next generation, since many of us have been through generations? You heard Carrie's experiences from the 70s, mine from the late 80s. We're raising generation after generation who have lived in this conflict. So what do you say to the youth to get them to be able to take upon themselves the mantle of peace building and perhaps move us to a different place in the future?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you, and the invitation is welcome. And It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Let me make a remark regarding something that was mentioned by Kai, because I think it is crucial to this whole discussion. And this is about the feeling of insecurity of Israelis, that they feel that, they are always under threat. And he also mentioned something that I think is very important about the fact that he did not feel that there is hatred or enmity between Egyptians and Israelis. But at the same time, Egypt has had peace with Israel for the last 40 plus years, and peace between Jordan and Israel for more than a quarter of a century. But they are still called peace. And the reason is pertaining to the fact that the Palestinian issue is not resolved. It is not about anything else. So in order for things to move, I think one of the issues that is not appreciated enough by Israeli public opinion is that there are millions and millions of people around the Arab world who really have no problem with Israel today. And the agreements, the peace agreements that took place recently is a reflection of that. So what is happening today between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, between Bahrain and Israel and so on, is a reflection of the fact that, they're willing to move along and overcome this issue. But they still are saying, even in the last war that in May, the Emiratis were saying, we need to end this conflict. So I think that this is an important lesson for all of us. As to your question, I think it's a very sad situation and a very sad question. And I'm very sorry that I don't have a good answer. All what I can say is that we have failed, our generation has failed to advance peace on the Palestinian front in order for us to be able to leave this area to the next generation in a much better place than we found. And unfortunately, the burden will go to them. And it is very interesting that when we talk to young people, the vast majority of them are saying, well, you've been quibbling for the last 70 years on one state, two states, whatever it is. We want our rights. So they may be taking a new approach once they are in control. The problem in this world that we aren't giving them an opportunity to be in control. Whether it's in the Arab world with the leaders staying for many, many years in their positions, or even in Israel that also saw a prime minister that stayed for 12 years, which was unprecedented. So unfortunately, the young generation has its work cut out for it, and they will, once they take the leadership, they will have to think anew in relation to how they can advance peace in a more constructive way, rather than in the manner in which we, the old generation, have dealt with it for years.
I
Thank
think,
you.
Hesham, that the younger generation, at least those with whom I've interacted, no longer believe that peace is possible. And they're looking for other ways of moving this forward. We believed that peace was possible way back when. And I think that belief has been lost. And until we get back to the idea that, yes, we believe that peace is possible, but believe that everybody deserves their own rights, and not just sit there and say, oh, this is the way it is. There's never going to be any peace. I might as well just get what I can get out of it right now. That's the dangerous thing. And that's what I see happening.
If I can add to that, Maureen,
please.
Something that Hisham said, my point was going to be very similar to what Carrie just said. Lucy mentioned some of the peace building programming and the sort of ecosystem, we call it, of organizations that are trying to build understanding across communal lines. If I had advice, and I don't have the magic bullet to answer your question, Maureen, but if I had advice in this space, it would be, to Carrie's point, empathy and respect for the experiences of others, of other identity groups that are not my own, that is not coming at the expense of my own. And that's what these peace building programs are really doing, is trying to weave a social fabric within and across identity lines in Israelis and Palestinians. When you look at the polling, and how folks feel, especially youth, feel about others. Individuals are fine. They have a Palestinian friend, they have an Israeli, but it is a distrust of the identity group on the other side. So having a greater sense of respect and empathy and humanization for identity groups that are different than my own would be a step forward. And then again, to the question of what I would recommend for young people, participation in politics in the process, active participation and holding leadership accountable. To your point, Carrie and Hisham, about we have past generations have failed. That's it's largely a leadership issue. Leaders have failed to inspire their people to move the ball forward. So I think more active participation in the political process and more active measures of accountability by young people to push leadership forward would be something to recommend. And then I think Mike is also here. I'll hand it to Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Actually, you gave me a perfect segue because I was going to pick up on that point of the nature of domestic politics as a driver for each side in determining how far people can go, how far the leaders could go. But I would not want to, in any which way, underestimate the value of leadership in terms of being able to reach a conclusion. We have seen in the past, in the case of Egypt and Jordan in particular, where you had very strong leaders who were really taking bold action to reach out as they did to Israel, and the same thing for Israelis leaders. As we know, some have paid with it, with their lives, if you will. But the politics that have occurred in Israel and the Palestinian side, and even in the region, has changed a lot in such a way that you have to worry about how far leaders are willing to risk taking those chances for peace. And here's where, again, the youth come in. But the youth, we've been hearing a lot from the youth of saying that some of them are saying they're done with this conflict, that they want to get on with their lives. They want to be able to go to universities and take jobs and so on, and that this is their parents' generation conflict. Except it is and it isn't. I mean, it is also an identity conflict as well, which is what makes it particularly thorny amongst all conflicts. And people have tried to reduce it in terms of saying that it's a territorial conflict, it's a religious conflict. It's a multi-dimensional conflict by every stretch of imagination. And working, the best thing that I think youth can do, and maybe this picks up Kerry's point about how do people become more secure? How do they feel more secure? And what we have witnessed is actually a separation of the parties. Years ago, you would go to Israel and you would see Israelis and Palestinians constantly interacting, much less so now. And particularly between, Israelis who would go to the West Bank and Palestinians who would go into Israel proper. So you don't see that as much. And that lack of interaction allows for myths and all sorts of bad ideas to develop about the other party and the other, and allowing them each to savor their own narrative of grievances that really do keep people apart. So I think the notions, and Lucy has gone through a good list of some of the things we've done to try to bring people together at the domestic level, because that's what you really need for giving the support to the leaders.
To your point, Mike, I think it's absolutely true. And I think that's one of the interpretations of the new coalition of the Israeli government right now. They're saying, we're not going to solve this right now, the external problems, but our house is a mess. That recent war exacerbated things or brought things to the fore. And so what they said is, let's get our house together. It doesn't matter what our policies are vis-a-vis the external world. Let's cooperate. So let's bring in Ram, let's bring in Yamina, let's bring in all these extreme groups so we can get our house back together again and then deal with the problems.
I agree. And Mike, to your point, I'll just give you my personal experience. Living in Israel during the first Intifada, we had several parties, and so I was in physics, right? Just not in a political community. And I just remember one party when we had our Arab Israeli colleagues from the department and their kids running around, and my Israeli colleagues and their kids running around. And what was playing over the radio at the time was the Voice of Peace, broadcasting from somewhere in the Mediterranean. So pirate radio broadcasting from a ship off the coast of Israel. And it was playing all the latest music, some of which I hadn't even heard out of the States. And it was an opportunity where people just let their guard down, and we really felt you know, a camaraderie where everybody could sing, and we watched the kids all play together. I'm fearing those days are past, and I do look forward to them returning at some point. So with that, Lucy, I am going to give you the last word on where we go tomorrow.
Thank you, Maureen. I think I can answer that by sewing together a few of the threads that that were just offered, which is so important and key to answering that question. I think there's a bit of a catch-22 sequencing challenge. One of the slides I didn't show, Maureen, you saw it earlier, was a statement that former Senator George Mitchell made when he was speaking at USIP back in 2017. We actually hosted him. He was keynoting for an event we did in partnership with the Embassy of Ireland, reflecting on lessons learned from the Northern Ireland conflict that could be applied to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And of course, Senator Mitchell had been involved as a mediator on both of those conflicts, somewhat more successfully in the Northern Ireland context. But he was talking about the Good Friday Agreement that he helped bring about. And he said, you know, peace agreements such as the Good Friday Agreement don't make peace, they make peace possible. And this gets to Kerry's point I think he was making earlier about you need to bring a piece of paper. The challenge that you're seeing, and especially with all these hardening attitudes and the younger generation that we've been talking about, is you need both happening simultaneously. As Mike has said, the leadership, and Mike and Hisham and Robert have alluded to the leadership thing, the people are looking for the leaders to lead. And at this point, the leaders aren't leading, and they need to be propelled to lead and make changes by being held accountable by the people. And you haven't been seeing either of those dynamics in this regard. And so trying to get people to focus on understanding the other and the empathy that is so important that Robert's talking about in the midst of an active conflict. And for the Palestinians living under occupation and trying to engage in that kind of work, it's very hard to get both sides with the again, these mirror image attitudes and experiences they have towards each other to engage in this work. So there's a bit of a vicious cycle and a catch-22 that happens where you need to be doing this work now in order to build momentum towards a diplomatic agreement, but that work is going to need to continue in order to sustain those agreements. And so this is the conundrum what we wrestle with every day at USIP, with the top down and the bottom up, and trying to connect those efforts constantly. I want to reflect on something as well that Kerry said, which is, I think that's exactly right. What you're seeing certainly on the Israeli side is, let's get our house back together and then we'll deal with the conflict. But the challenge with this conflict is that it doesn't stand still. People often use the term status quo, but it's not static, and the situation on the ground isn't static. So as we've seen, you can't just leave this conflict aside and come back to it, because you're not going to come back to it in the same place that it was when you left it. Conditions will be more difficult. The ability to get to a negotiated agreement will be that much harder. The problems aren't going away. Get back to my point of fireproofing rather than just firefighting, because you're fighting a different and more combustible fire each time. And so this is really the challenge, I think, facing the leaders and the grassroots constituencies who are trying to wrestle with these issues. I think there is an opportunity here. I will reflect again on another set of polling in the context of a study. I talked about the decline in support for a two-state solution, and Ambassador Youssef talked about the younger generation on the Palestinian side saying, I'm done with solutions and in states. I want my states, I just need my rights. I want my rights in one state. When you poll Israelis and Palestinians again, and there's been a lot of polling recently on alternatives to the two-state solution as well, there has been rapid decline in support for a two-state solution, but there still remains a plurality of support on each side for a two-state solution over any other alternative. Because what people keep coming back to is the only way this conflict will be sustainably resolved is with a two-state solution, but I just don't see how we get there in the current climate. And so it isn't really another politically feasible option or one that I can get my head around, but you can't tell me anymore that the two-state solution works. And that's where that despair has set in. They need a political horizon, the idea that it's not just a mantra of we're going back to two states as the ultimate destination, but what are we doing to move? Again, we can't just put the conflict aside and come back and deal with that later. We need to prevent things from happening that will prevent a two-state solution ever taking hold. And so I think this is the challenge of the study I was referring to. RAND did a study that was analyzing, came out in February, the alternatives to two states, and that's where these findings came from. I will end therefore on a note where I find a little bit of optimism, if I had to inject some optimism here, and it speaks to these dynamics we've just been discussing in the last few minutes. In 2013, we supported a poll that was done by the University of Maryland that was polling Israelis and Palestinians. And at that time, it was being conducted in the context of the negotiations and the second term of Obama that Secretary Kerry was leading, in which Mike was involved. And the poll was looking at Israeli and Palestinian attitudes and potential support for what was presented as a likely package deal that would be presented at the end of final status negotiations. And the elements of the deal were derived from previous rounds of negotiations and what people would assume such a deal would look like. And I thought that the most interesting finding of that poll was when the pollsters went back to the populations on both sides who said, no, I would not sign on to this deal. I would not support it. They went back to that group on each side and said, oh, the other side has agreed to it. The other side has signed on. Now do you support it? On the Israeli side, support jumped by 10%. And on the Palestinian side, it jumped by 20%. So what that tells you again, that belief that the other side is a good faith partner, there's a collective action problem, right? The belief that the other side is a good faith partner will increase support. Belief in the feasibility of a solution will increase support. And you've seen this when you track polling across time. As much cynicism as people have toward diplomatic processes, anytime there has been an active process, support for a two-state solution, optimism goes up. So it's this nexus again that Mike and Hisham and Robert spoke to, of the role of leaders and the role of publics to hold leadership accountable, to push their leaders in a certain direction. So the momentum has to come from all sides. So again, I put hope in the fact that public opinion is dynamic, that progress begets progress, and that trust begets trust. And so that's a broad prescription. It's going to take many micro building blocks to get there. But that's the work we certainly at least are trying to do our small part with at USIP. And I really thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective, analysis, and some of that work with you today.
Excellent. Thank you, Lucy. That was an excellent way to end with a little element of hope. And I thank you, Lucy, and Ambassador Yosef, and Robert, and Mike for joining us. Kerry, of course, you are always a pleasure to have you, whether you're talking on Israel or cybersecurity. And I thank NSF for participating with us. Stay tuned for our announcement for our August program. And I wish everybody safety in these crazy times, particularly those of us in the West and fire country. So be safe, stay cool, and we will see you next month. Thank you very much.